October 15th, 1946. Nuremberg prison. 10:44 p.m. A man is found dead in his cell. He was supposed to hang in exactly 2 hours. The most powerful Nazi after Hitler, the man who built the Luftwaffe, who ran the German economy, who ordered the Holocaust logistics, is lying cold on his cot with a crushed cyanide capsule beside his lips. The hangman is standing outside with a rope and nothing to do. Nobody knows how he got the poison. Nobody saw anything. Nobody confessed. And that mystery would haunt historians, investigators, and governments for the next 60 years. This is a story of Hermann Göring's final act. The last con of man who spent his entire life getting away with things he shouldn't have. Let's go back to the beginning of the end. November 1945. The Nuremberg trials begin. 21 of the most powerful men in the Third Reich are sitting in a wooden dock, facing charges of war crimes, crimes against humanity, and conspiracy to wage aggressive war. And right there, front row, seat number 1, Hermann Göring. He is 52 years old. He weighs nearly 270 pounds. He is bloated, pale, and wearing a washed-out Luftwaffe uniform stripped of its medals. He looks like a man who has been deflated. And in many ways, he has been. American prison doctors had spent months weaning him off his paracodeine addiction, a morphine-based drug he had been taking since the 1920s. He had been popping 100 pills a day by the time he surrendered. But here's the first twist you need to understand about Göring. The moment the drugs left his system, a completely different man showed up to that courtroom. Sharp, fast, funny, dangerous. The prosecutors had prepared for a broken addict. They got a chess grandmaster. Within the first week of the trial, Göring was coaching the other defendants on how to answer questions. He was passing notes. He was whispering legal strategies. The American chief prosecutor Robert Jackson, one of the most brilliant legal minds of his generation, walked into that courtroom expecting to dismantle Göring on the stand. What happened instead became one of the most famous cross-examination disasters in legal history. Göring sat in the witness box for 3 days. 3 days. He turned every question into a speech. He interrupted Jackson. He corrected translators. He reframed accusations as acts of patriotism. He made arguments that made the audience in the gallery murmur in uncomfortable agreement. Jackson became visibly flustered. At one point, the judges had to repeatedly intervene just to stop Göring from speaking. Reporters in the room wrote that Göring was winning. A man on trial for some of the worst crimes in human history was winning his own war crimes trial. But here's what nobody in that courtroom knew yet. Göring already knew he was going to die. He had accepted it. He had made peace with it in his own twisted way. What he was fighting for was not his life. He was fighting for his legacy. He wanted history to remember him not as a criminal, but as a loyal German soldier who did what had to be done. That was a performance. That was the con. And it worked to a point. The judges were not swayed. On October 1st, 1946, Hermann Göring was found guilty on all 4 counts. The sentence was death by hanging. Göring listened to the verdict without expression. Then he walked back to his cell, sat down, and began to plan. Because Hermann Göring had one final problem with the death sentence, and it had nothing to do with dying. It was the method. Hanging was a criminal's death, a thief's death, a coward's death. Göring had been a World War I flying ace, a decorated war hero, one of the most powerful men in Europe for over a decade. He had built an air force from nothing. He had stood at Hitler's right hand. He could accept death, but he absolutely could not accept dying at the end of a rope like a common murderer. He requested to be shot by firing squad. It was a soldier's death, an honorable death. The Allied Control Council rejected the request without discussion. It would be hanging. October 16th, 1946, 1 a.m. And that was the moment, right there, that Göring decided he would not let them hang him. Somewhere, somehow, he had to find a way to die on his own terms. The question was, how do you smuggle a suicide capsule into one of the most heavily guarded prisons in the world? Nuremberg prison in 1946 was not a normal prison. It had been specifically redesigned and reinforced to hold the most dangerous and historically significant prisoners on Earth. Every cell was under 24-hour surveillance. Guards checked on prisoners every 30 seconds through a small window in each cell door. Prisoners slept with their hands visible above their blankets at all times. If a hand disappeared under a blanket, a guard entered immediately. No exceptions. Göring's cell was cell 5. It was on the ground floor. It measured roughly 13 feet by 6 feet. There was a cot, a table, a chair, and a toilet with no privacy screen. Every item that entered that cell was inspected. His food was checked. His books were checked. His mail was read. His meetings with his lawyer were monitored. The Americans running the prison were obsessed with one thing above all else: making sure none of the defendants killed themselves before they could be executed. The Nazi leadership had a history of suicide. Hitler himself had done it. Himmler bit a cyanide capsule the moment he was captured. Goebbels poisoned himself and his children. The Allies were determined that justice, public, documented, witness justice, would be served at Nuremberg. So how, inside this fortress of surveillance, did a 270-pound man with no privacy manage to hide a cyanide capsule? That question has 3 possible answers, and each one is more disturbing than the last. The first theory, and the one most historians initially accepted, is that Göring had the capsule with him the entire time. When he surrendered to American forces in May 1945, he arrived with an enormous amount of luggage, dozens of suitcases, trunks, and bags filled with looted artwork, documentation, personal items, and medications. Some of those bags were checked thoroughly. Some were not. The theory is that a cyanide capsule was hidden in one of his personal items from the very beginning, hidden so well that 17 months of searches never found it. But here's the problem with that theory. Göring was strip searched multiple times. His cell was torn apart and inspected repeatedly. His personal items were cataloged and recatalogued. It seems almost impossible that a physical capsule could survive 17 months of searches without being discovered, unless it was hidden somewhere nobody thought to look. And this is where the story gets deeply uncomfortable. When Göring's belongings were finally inventoried after his death, investigators found 3 brass cartridge cases among his personal effects. Inside 2 of them, nothing suspicious. Inside the third, a small handwritten note. The note was from Göring himself. It explained exactly what he had done and why. He had written it to the Allied commanders to make sure they understood he was not being helped by anyone. He wanted to take full credit for outsmarting them. The note said he had possessed the poison capsule the entire time. He said he had 3 capsules total when he was captured. 1 was in his luggage, 1 was hidden in a jar of skin cream, and 1 he kept on his body in a place so personal that guards were reluctant to conduct the kind of search that would have found it. But even that explanation raised more questions than it answered, because other investigators found evidence pointing in a completely different direction. The second theory, and the one that exploded into public consciousness decades later, is that someone on the inside gave Göring the poison. In 2005, a former U.S. Army lieutenant named Herbert Lee Stivers came forward. He was 78 years old. He had been a guard at Nuremberg prison in 1946, and he had a confession to make. Stivers admitted that during the trial, he had developed a friendship with a young German woman who used to wait outside the prison, hoping to catch a glimpse of proceedings. She was attractive. He was a young American soldier far from home. They talked. They flirted. She eventually asked him a favor. She said she had friends who wanted to pass personal letters and small items to Göring through his lawyer. She told Stivers the items were just personal mementos, a pen, a small container, nothing dangerous. She said it would mean a lot to her. Stivers, young and trying to impress her, agreed for nearly 60 years because he was terrified of the consequences. But there was a third theory, and this one pointed not at a guard, not at Göring himself, but at someone with direct access, institutional power, and a capsule beside him. The truth is, nobody knows for certain which of these theories is correct. Possibly elements of all 3 are true, Possibly the answer is something else entirely that was never uncovered. What we do know is this. At some point on October 15th, 1946, Hermann Göring held a tiny glass capsule in his fingers and made a decision, and the world was about to find out that he had been planning this moment for a very long time. October 15th, 1946, the day of the executions. 10 men were scheduled to die that night. Julius Streicher, Hans Frank, Wilhelm Keitel, Alfred Rosenberg, Ernst Kaltenbrunner, Fritz Sauckel, Alfred Jodl, Arthur Seisencourt, Joachim von Ribbentrop, and at the very top of the list, Hermann Wilhelm Göring. The executions would begin at 1 a.m. on October 16th. They would be conducted in the gymnasium of the Nuremberg Palace of Justice. 3 wooden gallows had been constructed inside. The men would be brought out one by one. American witnesses, journalists, and military officials would be present. It was designed to be witnessed, documented. Final, throughout October 15th, the condemned men were kept in their cells under intensified surveillance. Guards checked every 30 seconds. Meals were delivered and consumed under observation. Göring ate his evening meal. He spoke with the prison chaplain, who later said Göring was calm, eerily calm, and showed no signs of fear. At approximately 9 p.m., Göring was visited by his lawyer, Dr. Otto Stamer. The visit was brief. After Stamer left, Göring returned to his cot. At 10 p.m., a guard checked cell 5 and found Göring lying on his cot, hands visible, eyes open, staring at the ceiling. Normal. At 10:20 p.m., another check, still lying there. At 10:44 p.m., the guard looked through the window and saw Göring's body had not moved. Something felt wrong. The guard entered the cell. Hermann Göring was dead, on the floor beside his cot, a crushed brass cartridge case, and beside it, the broken remains of a thin glass ampoule. The smell of bitter almonds, the unmistakable chemical signature of cyanide, was in the air. The prison erupted. Officers were called. The duty officer, Colonel Burton Andrus, the man personally responsible for the security of the prisoners, was woken and told the news. Andrus reportedly went white. He had spent 17 months making absolutely certain not one of these men would escape justice. He had enforced every rule, every check, every search, and Göring had beaten him anyway. The reaction inside the prison among the other condemned men varied in ways that revealed something deeply human, unworthy of a German military officer. He said history would judge him differently than the court had. He left a note to his wife, Emmy. She had been trying to visit him for months and had been largely denied access. The note was personal, and its exact contents were never fully made public. But those who read it described it as a love letter, a farewell, something that, stripped of everything else about the man, read like something a husband writes to a wife he genuinely loves. He left a note to the prison chaplain, thanking him for their conversations, while making clear that he remained unrepentant about his political beliefs. Each note was designed. Each one was placed deliberately. This was not a panic decision. This was not a man acting in desperation at the last moment. This was a man who had been rehearsing this in his mind for weeks, maybe months. He had choreographed his own death with the same theatrical flair he had brought to every other aspect of his life. The lavish uniforms, the stolen art, the courtroom speeches, even dying. Hermann Göring was performing. But there is one detail about that night, one small, almost throwaway detail, that almost nobody talks about, and it might be the most chilling thing in this entire story. When investigators searched cell 5 after Göring's death, they found that his bunk was neatly made. His uniform was straightened. His personal items were arranged with unusual tidiness. He had cleaned his cell before he died. Hermann Göring, a man who had spent 17 months in prison, who had been stripped of his medals and his power and his drugs, had spent some portion of his final evening making his bed and tidying up as though expecting company, as though he wanted to leave a good impression. Even in death, he could not stop performing, and the performance had one final devastating act, one that would not be revealed for another 57 years. For nearly 6 decades, the question of how Hermann Göring got his poison was one of history's great unsolved mysteries. The U.S. Army launched an immediate investigation in October 1946. They interviewed every guard, every staff member, every person who had entered the prison in the weeks leading up to the execution. They re-examined every item that had been brought into Göring's cell. They analyzed the cartridge cases found beside his body. They found nothing conclusive. The investigation was quietly closed. The official position became that Göring must have hidden the capsule himself upon his capture. It was the cleanest explanation. It put the failure on a single point of entry 17 months earlier rather than on the prison security that had been maintained ever since. But the explanation never fully satisfied anyone, because in 2005, Herbert Lee Stivers changed everything. Stivers was a 78-year-old grandfather living in California when he came forward to a German news magazine. He told the story of the girl, the pen, the small containers, his belief that he had been used, completely unknowingly, as a delivery mechanism for the poison that killed Göring. His account was detailed. It was specific. It matched the timeline. And it named a specific woman, though by the time investigators tried to trace her, she had been dead for years, taking whatever she knew with her. But here's the part of the Stivers story that almost nobody focuses on, because it raises a question that is far more unsettling than who smuggled the poison. If Stivers is telling the truth, someone on the outside, someone with connections, resources, and a plan, had been working for months to get a cyanide capsule to Göring. That means Göring was not acting alone. It means there was a network. It means people on the outside believed enough in Göring, or feared what he might say on the gallows, that they organized a covert operation inside the most heavily surveilled prison in the Western world. Who were those people? Where did they come from? What did they want? Those questions have never been answered. And there is one more layer to this story, one that pulls the entire thing into an even darker place. The 3 brass cartridge cases found in Göring's cell after his death. 2 were empty. 1 contained his farewell note. But investigators later noted that these cartridge cases were an unusual item for a prison cell. They were small, innocuous, the kind of thing that might be passed off as a personal keepsake. They were engraved. They looked decorative, which raises a possibility that has never been definitively ruled out, that the capsule was not hidden on Göring's body or smuggled in by a guard. It was hidden inside one of those cartridge cases, sitting in plain sight among his personal effects, checked repeatedly and dismissed as a sentimental military memento, right there, in front of everyone, for 17 months. If that is true, then Hermann Göring did not need a smuggler. He did not need a doctor. He did not need a lovesick American soldier. He had the answer the entire time, sitting on his own table, hiding behind its own ordinariness, which would mean that every search, every inspection, every 30-second cell check was theater, Göring's theater, the last performance of a man who understood that the best place to hide something is in plain sight, dressed as something boring. And that brings us to the most haunting question of all, not how he died, but what it means. Hermann Göring was guilty. Of that there is absolutely no doubt. He was convicted of planning and executing some of the most catastrophic violence in human history. The Holocaust, the destruction of European cities, the enslavement of millions of forced laborers, the systematic theft of an entire continent's cultural heritage. He deserved the sentence he received, but he didn't receive it. He died on his own terms, in his own time, in a room he had tidied, with letters he had written and placed where they would be found. On a cot he had made, he closed his eyes, bit down, and walked out of history on his own schedule. And the Allied powers, the greatest military coalition in human history, who had defeated Nazi Germany, who had constructed the most elaborate prisoner surveillance system ever assembled, who had dedicated 17 months to ensuring the specific man would face justice, stood in a gymnasium with a rope and nothing to hang. The psychological impact of Göring's escape rippled far beyond the Nuremberg courtroom. It fed into post-war conspiracy theories. It became a foundational story in neo-Nazi mythology, the idea that Göring, even in defeat, had beaten the Allies one final time. For decades, that story was used to romanticize a mass murderer. That is Göring's final crime. Not the poison, not the escape. The legacy he manufactured in that cell. The narrative he carefully constructed through those final notes and that final night. He was a propagandist to the very end, and his last piece of propaganda was his own death. But there is something mythology always leaves out. While Göring was tidying his cell and writing his theatrical farewell notes on the night of October 15th, 10 of his co-defendants were walking one by one into a gymnasium and facing what he would not face. Some of them went quietly. Some of them made final statements. Some of them prayed. One of them, Hans Frank, reportedly walked the gallows saying he deserved his punishment. None of them escaped. None of them had Göring's resources or his connections, or his decades of cunning, or his willingness to plan, manipulate, and deceive right up to the last possible second. And maybe that is the realest thing you can say about Hermann Göring. Not that he was brave, not that he was clever, not that he outsmarted history, but that even at the very end, even facing death, he could not stop using people, could not stop scheming, could not stop performing, could not for one single moment just be a human being accountable for what he had done. The rope was waiting at 1 a.m. He just couldn't give anyone the satisfaction. The cell was empty. The gymnasium had one fewer rope to use. And somewhere in the official record of the Nuremberg trials, there's a line that reads simply, Göring, Hermann, sentenced to death, sentence not carried out, for words that took 60 years to even begin to explain. And depending on which theory you believe, they may never be fully explained at all.